Welcome to You Rise Me Up, a podcast about Asian Europeans from all walks of life. I'm your host Qing, a German-born Chinese. Today I have with me Chunchun Qiu, the German-Chinese co-founder and CEO of Cyclio, a company helping women manage their painful periods. After almost 3 years of working on this venture, Chunchun and her co-founder decided to shut it down. Before that, she spent several years in finance and management consulting. Chunchun and I met at a startup event in Berlin, and I was very curious to learn more about her journey and what she has learned from it. It's so nice to have you here. Thank you for joining, Chunchun.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
So, Chunchun, you recently went through quite a journey with your startup Cyclio. So, as a founder, you constantly need to pitch yourself. And in that context, I was wondering, what experiences in life have really shaped you and what makes you you?
Friends who have been with me throughout my entire life and professional career have described me as a small terrier dog. If I find something that I'm really passionate about, or if I find a topic that I think is really worth standing up for, I will do so. I won't let go until I have achieved a certain amount of success. That's a huge part of me, I would say. I think this part of me comes definitely from my childhood being the first 1.5 generation, because I wasn't born here in Germany. I was born in China. And then I moved to Germany when I was 8. Beforehand, my parents and I were in Singapore. So I moved quite a lot as a kid. And if you are literally uprooted that many times, you develop a survival and also a fighting instinct for yourself. And this, I think, laid the foundation.
Where in China were you born or did you grow up? And also, what was the transition like from life in Singapore to life in Germany?
My dad left for Europe when I was 1 year old in 1987. I was born in Shanghai. My mom is Shanghainese. My dad is from the South. And he got a doctoral degree so he could go to Germany to do his doctoral degree at that time, which was really, really rare for Chinese people to have that opportunity because it was just right after the Cultural Revolution. He was amongst the first people leaving the country, actually. And then having this great opportunity, my mom was actually faced with raising me alone, and she was working full time. I was basically growing up without my dad, but like within the family of my mom. And then she left when I was 3 years old to join my dad. So I was staying with the family for another 3 years until I was 6. And then we moved together to Singapore while my dad found a job after his doctoral degree. In Singapore, most of the people know a lot of Chinese people there. Chinese is definitely the main language after English. And then 3 years later, we moved to Germany. I can say that I definitely struggled with immersing into so different cultures in that young age. I didn't speak any word in German when I came here. So I had to repeat the final year. And then I got the recommendation to go to schools that offered the A level. And I do remember that this time I had to study a lot, do a lot of extra work to gain mastery of German. I was constantly socially probably very awkward because I was not acquainted to the German culture. I had no friends. This is the things that happen if you move your kid a lot. They're never getting the chance to actually settle and find friends. And I didn't achieve that until I went to 6th grade, because then I spoke up to my parents. This was this is so exhausting for me. We need to stay at some place so I can actually find some friends. It's been tough. But at the same time, everything that is tough has a great side of it also, which is me fighting through and going through all these experiences.
What did your parents actually do, or what are they actually doing professionally? And what was their experience like adapting to German culture or settling in Germany?
My dad is a marine engineer. So he studied industrial engineering, but always with regards to ships and stuff like that. And my mom is actually a pediatrician. But unfortunately, at that time in the 1980s, 90s, international certifications for doctors weren't available yet. And in order to be able to work as a doctor in Germany, she would have had to do the entire medical studies again in German. which was really a far-fetched. And back then she already had a family, so she opted for taking care of the family. But not being able to work as a doctor, I would say, has affected my mom very much in terms of development, in terms of self-esteem, in terms of fulfillment in life. Both of them are highly educated. I think what they have achieved was great because they came here with nothing, zero in the bank account, zero network, nothing. And they have achieved to find a job. My dad was able to nurture us and finance the family until I was 20 something, going off to work by myself. So from where they started, it was a huge shift. But at the same time, also on my father's side, I do know he had some capabilities that were never used fully in his career because of the language barrier. From what they've started, they have achieved a lot, and I really respect and grateful for this. But at the same time, on both parents' side, I think there has been potential left. I think now that they are older, it's not bothering them anymore. For them, it's like they look forward to have some grandchildren at some point in their lives and they're enjoying retirement. I really wish them this enjoyment. But at the same time, I do know that when I was younger, in my studies, there was this feeling that things weren't as great as they could be. And of course, with the developments happening in China at the same time, with the economy growing that much with that force, and nobody really could have foreseen it, there has been questions about would it have been better to go back actually? And those kind of discussions, I remember those. But I guess in the end, the great integration part of my family story is that they do value the culture here in sense of just democracy, free speech, and also a social security.
You mentioned this unrealized potential, and I think a lot of immigrant families probably have this feeling. And you mentioned it a couple of times. So I was also wondering, you obviously noticed it and also realized that your parents sacrificed quite a lot to build this life in Germany and also to settle in Germany. But how has this affected you? Has that somehow translated into specific ways of raising you?
Yeah, my parents always had very high standards of what I should achieve. I guess in part it's rooted in the Chinese culture. Being really good in academics was the way, and it's still the way that my father values. And it's the only way that my father values. There's no other way. But I think I was thrown into situations cold water wise a lot. And my parents weren't around much when I was younger in my puberty, dealing with all the stuff of puberty. The good thing about the upbringing was that I didn't feel that it was a difference whether I was a boy or a girl. He always said, you can do anything, but the standards were always very high and I should be the one finding my own way to it. It's not like my parents could have helped me a lot. It's just the implications, right? That your parents have to work to struggle to provide the finances for the family. And then you're by yourself quite a lot.
What eventually motivated you to become a founder? Like, what's the story behind Cyclio?
For Cyclio is a very specific personal experience. It was the first year of the lockdown in COVID 2020. So I've been practicing yoga and it was just part of my sports routine, I guess. And with the lockdown, I didn't move much anymore with home office and stuff like that. And at some point, I got really bad menstrual cramps to the point that I was not able to sit straight without taking any medication. This was a very much personal experience where I said, like, holy shit, why is there nothing out there that tells me why this is happening? And I thought by myself, truly, my body is getting old. I was over 30 years old. I thought my body is just changing. It's supposed to be like that, maybe. So I didn't really question this. And then it was a coincidence that I started my yoga teacher training. And then all of a sudden, my cramps were getting really, really better. Like I almost had none. And then I went into medical studies to look it up, to actually also validate my personal experience. And I found great medical literature to all this stuff. And I was just like, oh, this has to be available to all women out there. Like you shouldn't have to suffer for ages in my case, it was just a few months. I know people who suffered long years of pain, and this shouldn't be the case. So I was just fueled by this personal experience. And I have to say, I was contemplating founding a business for quite a while back then, but I never found a case that I was personally so invested in. Also to ditch a really high paid secure job back then. This came all together when I founded Cyclio. And that was actually a really nice time when I remember that. It was really high passion.
Chunchun, you said even before stumbling upon this problem that you were really passionate about, you had the thought of founding your own business in the back of your mind, or it was a goal of yours. That actually really resonates with me. But I was wondering, like, for you personally, where do you think that comes from? Because it seems to be a pattern. I hear that from a lot of people, especially with immigration backgrounds, but also particularly among us Asians. And I wonder where that comes from. And I suppose like every motivation is slightly different, but I just wanted to hear your perspective on it.
I truly have to say that I felt out of place working in those positions that I had before. It was always something didn't feel right. And then when the whole startup economy picked up in Germany, I was confronted more with great ideas, more digital ideas, and it gradually developed. Also, knowing what your parents have achieved from where they started, there was something about that I also want for myself. Maybe that's something that would connect my experience or my thinking to other founders in the Asian community, is that if you see what your parents were capable of doing, it would give me great pride to follow into their footsteps in that sense. I didn't really notice it until I was in the journey already, but that was something that definitely provides a fuel to me as well.
That definitely resonates with me because I also keep saying and thinking, like, oh my God, my parents achieved so much without a university degree. And here I am with a master's degree. And so I always think I got a way better start with like a better education, more resources, a better network. I sometimes feel the pressure of outperforming them, but not out of a sense of competitiveness rather than a sense of gratitude because I want to give back. And I feel like a way to give back is basically to either match or like outperform them to make them proud.
Yeah, pride, right?
Yeah.
That's definitely something. I get that.
But then I don't know about you, but in my case, I sometimes almost feel like, at least like when I was going through that journey of like, okay, I think I want to found my own venture, I got the sense that my mom was worried, even though she herself had been independent all her life. Because of that, and because she knows what pressures and challenges come with it, she didn't actively discourage me from doing it, but she did throw worries or concerns at me that, of course, made me actually question my choice. And so, in that context, I was wondering how your parents actually reacted to your decision to quit your well paid, stable job and found Cyclio.
I would say even worse than your experience, basically. I still remember that phone call. I was calling them. I told them about my decision. I was very clear about not involving them in the process, but just telling them my decision because I knew that they would be very concerned because my parents also wanted me to have a stable job. So my parents, of course, even though they're very much educated, they don't know too much of the business world, right? Because my mom had a medical degree. She was working at some small firm. My dad is in engineering, so he's in a complete other industry. And I started my career in banking and I was working for Deutsche Bank, which is a name that people know. So it was like, oh, my daughter made it. She was working for Deutsche Bank and that's great. And then when I switched my first job, I went to PwC afterwards, which is also a big firm, but it's a firm that nobody really knows if they are not that close to business things. So my parents didn't know who PwC was. And when I told them, they were like, who's this? And they got scared, like even though PwC is bigger than Deutsche Bank. So from those experiences, I knew already that they would be concerned. And I do remember that my mom, she had her fair share of career failures because, as I said, her degree was never recognized here. So she couldn't work as a doctor. So she had really bad odyssey of finding a job here. From her view, I've never had a career setback. until then because I was able to find good jobs. So she was really concerned about what that entrepreneurial route would do to my mental health when I would be running against walls constantly, as she would with her experience. And I have to say, in terms of brick walls you will hit against, wow, she was absolutely right on that one. But at the same time, I'm very proud that I've made it through without major scars. I would say I have scars. Yes, everyone has scars from that. But there's still beautiful things that I'm taking out of this journey. But it wasn't that great of a reaction.
Why did you decide to close the company?
First of all, because our financing round didn't work out the way that we wanted. I would say that was the external factor. We didn't achieve our target amount. Our main investor, in the end, wasn't convinced that we were going to make it the way that we then would have to with that kind of money. And then the deal didn't go through.
How did you communicate the decision to close Cyclio, and how did your parents react to that?
I think it was a mix of relief and pride and worry. I have to say my parents were really supportive in the end of me being on that journey. Even though we didn't have a big team, but we were able to raise money enough to pay salaries for at least the founder team. And they were like, hey, you achieved the goal of sustaining financially yourself with a business that you created yourself, which is not a small task. And they said, like, you've proven that you're capable to do that. And we're really proud of that because they never achieved that part. So I thought it was really sweet that my parents acknowledged that proactively, actually. And they're happy for me that I'm closing that chapter right now. But I also told them I still would want to do something again. But I think they gained trust in my abilities, which is interesting. I didn't have that as a young person. I sort of like have the feeling that I had to earn it as an adult. It feels like a good achievement that now they trust me on this. But at the same time, I ask myself, when I have kids, do I want to raise them that kind of way that they have to earn my trust in their abilities? I don't know. I've not decided on it.
And what advice would you give your younger self?
You can get more help than you think. You don't have to do it all by yourself. And reaching out for help is really a great strength that could probably propel or accelerate growth. That's probably something I would tell her.
What were you thinking about when you gave out that advice? Because I find that usually when I ask that question, it's like very open, right? That people think about very specific situations or memories where they could have benefited from that piece of advice. Would you say that you, like in general or in the past, have been a person that really struggled to ask for help? What was going through your mind?
That memory specifically was me standing in front of my middle school after a day of fighting with friends back then, struggling with the culture integration because I was bullied a lot because of my ambitions in school. And as I said, being by myself a lot, at some point you do think you have to do it by yourself or it's all your responsibility. If you are a proactive person who takes up responsibility a lot, is per se a great thing, but some tasks, some challenges are easier if you ask for help quicker. And I think throughout my professional life, I recognize that pattern because I feel like I'm solely responsible for this task, for this project, also in my private life. There was a tendency of me not asking for help at the right time or delaying that. This is counter effective to the speed that you could be growing instead, and also to the trust you have to outside world. And I think the startup ecosystem actually proved me in that sense. A really great point is that so many people love to help out for nothing in return at first. Like, of course, you would give help back at some point eventually when you actually can give back the help, but people are just so willing to help. And that's something that I've never encountered in the professional area. I love this about the mentality that we have here. And it's not so transactional. Of course, you have to stand your grounds on when it is too much or something like that. But at the same time, for people showing me this kindness, It's inspired me a lot in terms of like how I think about professional growth and how you're able to trust more into the outside world rather than thinking you have to do it by yourself all the time.
Do you know why they bullied you? Being German Chinese myself, I would say every single one of us got picked on in one way or another. But I don't think I was actively bullied, but that was also because of people pleasing and conflict avoidance and so on.
It's funny because I'm trying to find out whether I am a people pleaser or not. Because in some constellations, I would say I do have those tendencies, but I think my strategy often is also going into conflict. I was part of a innovative class concept at that time at my school where the entire class, they were accelerating their speed going through the material. So instead of graduating middle school after 4 years, we were actually able to graduate as an entire class of 3 years. All of my class members were ambitious people, I guess, or at least hardworking classmates. So it wasn't that I was the class best in some subject, but we were all pretty good. The only thing that I struggled with in my youth is how to express boundaries in a healthy way, because I never learned this. I would declare that boundaries is something that in Chinese households and education's not taught. There's no such things like boundaries.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I feel like there's almost a certain kind of expectation that to be a good daughter or son in like Chinese culture, you need to be willing to help out at any time, no matter what it is, because they gave birth to you.
Yeah, exactly. That's the cultural discrepancy that you have. Well, if all of your surroundings, they have boundaries, they have a certain way of communication and you don't sync with that, there are a lot of conflict potential. And I do think that I struggled with that in my youth and probably is still something that I struggle with until today in some sense when it comes to conflict. And this is something that I need to work on. That's why like getting help and asking people for advice early on helped me a lot in the entrepreneur journey. But also, I think if I would have resorted to that strategy when I was younger, instead of fighting someone, but rather asking, like, what's your problem actually? Like, what's happening here? Instead of just going against this, maybe that would have created a better childhood for me.
I'm curious, do you have an example of when differences and boundaries resulted in conflict and when you actually entered the conflict? Because when I mentioned conflict avoidance, you said that sometimes you would actively go into conflict, which I actually perceive as rather unusual for someone of Chinese descent. So I'm very curious to hear about it and also to hear what that looked like for you.
I'm going to bring an example, not in the business world, but in my family life. There was a time when my mom wanted to buy an apartment because she wanted to make an investment and for her as a retirement safety net. And at that time, I think her credit score wasn't that awesome. And it was my first or second year of working. And at that time, I very much wanted to go back to the US to work because I studied there for a year. So I was in a completely different state of mind when she came with the request, I want to buy an apartment. Can you please buy that apartment with me? So being a dutiful daughter, usually someone would have said, okay, then let's do it because you're my mom, right? I denied that request and it created disappointment on my mom's side and also conflict in terms of like, why are you not supporting me? For me, it was like, no, I have my own life that I want to live. And this thing is putting a hurdle in my life plans that I don't know how to deal with. And there was little room to talk about that with my parents. And I've heard from Esther Perel, which is one of those relationship gurus on TEDx. She recently said, it's always worth to ask not what are you fighting about, but what are you fighting for? And this is so powerful in terms of like, I was fighting for independence. My parents were fighting for financial security. So could we have achieved something in between? I'm very certain that we could have, but it just got very narrowed down with the way that we were communicating with each other. And then that scenario, it left us with no option of me denying that request. I didn't enjoy that at all. And this is the powerful thing about knowing and reflecting yourself about what are you actually fighting for. And I think it helps with the communication rather than going back in, this is my boundary and this is, like no overstepping, please, something like that. That's my tendency because maybe in my early childhood, that boundary has been overstepped too much. So that was my only child strategy to like actually do something about it. But I think there is a middle ground on this, and I'm learning this right now. I'm trying to explain it more to my parents now, why I made that kind of decision that time. And it's not like they didn't achieve that. My mom bought that apartment anyways, which is great for her to realize how much power she had by herself. But at the same time, I want them to understand where I was coming from. And again, I'm very proud of my family in that sense. We always try to communicate with each other. It's very hard. We talk about very hard things. I think a lot of families don't even touch because it's always that it's better to have harmony. And my parents and I, we talk about the really tough stuff.
Chunchun, since that is something that is, like you already implied, quite unusual for Chinese families, given that you talk about tough stuff now, was that always the case? Did you talk to your parents about getting bullied, for example? If not, what do you think helped you to build that relationship with your parents?
I didn't start doing this until I was in my 20s. Before that, no, I didn't tell them anything. I was the classic puberty kid. The initiative for that was reflecting on how much my parents actually had to give up because I was back in the States studying abroad and tried to find a job there, an internship back then. It was really hard. And I realized through that process how hard it has been for my dad to actually settle in Germany with the cultural difference that he had to overcome, which was virtually none for me in the US. That shifted my perception of my parents, my dad in particular, because I wasn't very close to my dad when I was younger. With that shift came more gratitude, and I started to communicate with them more. But it started with that realization of me, like of how hard it must have been for him, like that true, authentic feeling, not the ones that the parents want you to have externally, but it came really out of my heart. From then, our relationship gradually evolved to that. But it was hard, and it's still a hard path that I'm going with them. There was a time 3 steps ahead and then 2 steps back. And then trying to make them also understand the cultural difference that I have with them. A lot of things that people have here, they say it's selfish. It's all these cultural differences. And I'm trying to tell them it's not. So funny. There's really a small anecdote. So my partner went back to my family's place with me the last time, and we were talking about where we want to raise our children. And for me, it was very clear that I don't want them to grow up in a small city because of the discrimination problems that I had. And my dad, as I said, wasn't aware of that kind of discrimination and bullying. So he said something like, well, if you study well enough, then you're really popular because the teachers like you, right? And I'm like, no, that's the complete opposite. What happens in Germany? That maybe happens in China. But here, if you're great and smart at school, people don't really necessarily like you. It's rather the opposite. My dad didn't believe me when I said that, but he believed when my partner, who's German, told him the same. That's how deep rooted those cultural differences are between both generations. It's very interesting in that sense.
What are some of the tough topics that you talk about nowadays that you wouldn't have talked about in the past?
Like what's happening right now in politics. It's a very scary time, to be honest. I want them to know where I stand, where they stand, what we should do when some things happen or do not happen. So politics, raising children, what kind of values do I want the children to have? What kind of values do I don't want them to have, even though my parents are living them? Those are very tough because it's not telling them, so everything you're doing is great, but it's telling them, I appreciate a lot of what you've did, but There are certain stuff I don't want my kids to have or experience. And it's tough as parents to hear that. But I do appreciate that they sit there and they actually listen to this. But it's been a journey with them on this.
Chunchun, thank you so much for taking part in the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And as always, if you're a listener and enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could take the time to rate this podcast or write a review on whatever platform you're listening on. Thank you.